If your grace signs that paper, Eastmere will have no autumn fortune left to count. Sophronia said, her quill still wet above the wool prices. Aldous, Duke of Eastmere, leaned over the library table, glanced from her ledger to her ink-stained fingers, and asked whether she had mistaken trading for knitting. Behind them, Hugh Burnley went still, because the paper under Aldous' hand was not a household bill. It was the contract that would decide Eastmere's harvest. The afternoon light fell across the Eastmere library shelves of leather-bound books, a polished mahogany table, and Sophronia Pembroke in a green wool gown mended twice at the waist. A cream shawl lay around her shoulders, plain and unadorned. She should have looked small in that room. She did not. Her hand rested beside a green calfskin ledger stitched at the spine with cream thread. It was not a proper book for a lady. A proper lady might copy invitations, keep household receipts, or write down a pattern for lace edging. Sophronia had done all those things when survival required it. But beside Eastmere's household expenses, she had written her own comparisons. Wool yields, grain forecasts, shipping notices from Portsmouth, port delays, broker margins, the truths men called business until a woman saw them. Cassius Ashby's draft contract lay beneath the Duke's signet ring. Ashby was the broker London trusted. Sophronia was an impoverished gentlewoman hired to sit with the dowager copy accounts and speak only when spoken to. Aldous' gaze dropped again to the figures she had marked. "Shouldn't you be knitting, Miss Pembroke?" he asked, "instead of trading like a clerk?" His voice was quiet and cold. He did not raise it. He spoke as a man who believed the world had an order, and that every person in it should remain where birth, gender, and custom had placed them. Sophronia felt the insult land like a familiar hand between her shoulders, pressing her down. A woman might count stitches. She might count teaspoons. She was never under any circumstance to count money in a room where men could hear. Her jaw tightened. She lowered neither her gaze nor her voice. "Knitting will not keep your tenants from starving this winter, Your Grace," she replied. "That contract will." Burnley shifted on the stone floor. He was watching the green ledger. He was watching the Duke. Aldous stood straight. Authority settled over him like a well-cut coat. He was 34 master of 3 rivers, 7 villages, and land that had fed his family for generations. He believed in ledgers, seals, and formal procedure. Emotion ruined estates. Contracts saved them. He looked at Sophronia's ink-stained hand, then at the dangerous column of numbers she refused to cover. "You will copy the household receipts, Miss Pembroke," he said. "You will leave the trading to men who understand it." He turned and walked toward the door, but he did not sign the paper. Sophronia watched him go. Only when the door closed did she breathe again. He had insulted her, yes. He had put her back into the corner where society preferred her, but the paper remained unsigned. Her warning had made a perfect contract look imperfect. For today, that was enough. By the end of the week, Aldous ordered Burnley to have Sophronia continue copying estate figures. It was called practical. The dowager needed little attention in the mornings. Burnley's eyes were failing. Sophronia had a neat hand. But Sophronia knew containment when it was dressed as usefulness. Aldous wanted to know exactly how much she had been looking at. Each morning she sat at the small drafty table near the library door. New papers waited for her: grain yields, timber rights, wool expectations, tenant arrears, notes from carriers and canal men. Aldous worked at the massive desk by the fire. He rarely spoke. His silence had the shape of a rule she could copy, but not advise. Sophronia accepted the rule, because anger spent too early only left a woman tired. Let him think he was punishing her. Access to the true numbers of a great estate was worth swallowing a daily slight. She copied the figures perfectly. At night, in the little room above the west passage, she lit one candle and transferred Eastmere's hidden shape into her green ledger. If a maid entered, she slid plain sewing over the page and picked up a needle. She did not guess. That was her armor. Every conclusion had a trail, a price circular, a past harvest, a port delay, a carrier's letter. Numbers could still be ignored, but they could not be accused of feminine hysteria. Aldous noticed. He noticed that she never sighed over the work. He noticed the permanent ink stain on her index finger. He noticed that when a column displeased her, she did not frown like a woman confused by arithmetic. She went still. That stillness began to irritate him. Then it began to interest him. He left more papers at the edge of his desk, papers she did not strictly need to copy. A canal surveyor's report, a letter from a Portsmouth wool merchant, an old account of hay prices from a cold summer 15 years earlier. He told himself it was a test of her discretion. Sophronia told herself the same thing. Neither believed it entirely. The summer settled into a quiet war. The county families began calling it Eastmere as August warmed the fields. Imogen Pelham, polished pretty and long expected by her mother to suit the Duke, came one Tuesday for luncheon. Sophronia sat near the far end of the table, her place neither servant nor guest. That was the difficulty of being a paid companion. She was genteel enough to be judged, and poor enough to be dismissed. "Miss Pembroke is so industrious," Imogen said, smiling over her wineglass. "Though I think she would be far more marriageable if she understood embroidery half as well as she understands Mr. Burnley's exchange rates. It is terribly unfeminine to frown so much." Conversation thinned. Sophronia set down her fork. The old instinct rose first. Smile. Soften. Pretend the insult had missed. She was tired of performing harmlessness for people who knew where to cut. "Embroidery rarely feeds a tenant through a hard winter, Lady Imogen," Sophronia said, "though I suppose a well-stitched rose is a comfort to look at while the larder empties." Imogen flushed. Her gaze flew to Aldous, demanding, without words, that he put the paid companion back in her place. "Your Grace," Imogen began sweetly, "surely Miss Pembroke forgets herself." Aldous did not look at Sophronia. He cut one precise piece of meat and set the knife down. "I heard Miss Pembroke perfectly," he said. The table went still. Imogen's mouth closed. Her fan trembled once. Aldous resumed his meal as though nothing improper had occurred. But when his eyes lifted at last, they locked on Sophronia's face. Not offended. Studying. That afternoon, when Burnley brought the day's copying to the library, Aldous asked, "Have Miss Pembroke's totals on the south pasture been checked?" "Twice, Your Grace," Burnley replied. "She found an error in the agent's edition, saved us £20. Aldous looked toward the little side table by the door. Sophronia was not there. The chair stood empty in the draught. It seemed suddenly absurd that a mind capable of catching what his paid agents missed should sit where cold air stiffened the ink. "Move her inkstand," Aldous said. Burnley blinked. "Your Grace, she is to work at the opposite end of the main desk. The draught by the door will ruin the parchment." It was not an apology. Aldous did not know how to apologize. But the next morning, Sophronia found her green ledger on the smooth mahogany near the fire. Her inkstand had been cleaned. A fresh quill lay beside it, trimmed to the angle she preferred. She looked up. Aldous was reading a letter, his face impassive. "The old quill split," he said without glancing at her. "It split 3 days ago," Sophronia replied. A pause. "Then you should have requested another." "And interrupted Duke at war with his correspondence, Burnley." Aldous lowered the letter by half an inch. Something almost like amusement crossed his eyes, then vanished. "Sit down, Miss Pembroke." She sat. The distance between them had changed. Not enough to be safe, enough to be noticed. Warmth grew not through confession, but through shared rhythm. The scratch of her quill matched his. When the fire burned low, she added a log without ringing. When a merchant's handwriting proved nearly illegible, Aldous slid the paper across the desk and waited. Sophronia translated the scrawl without comment. He began leaving the Portsmouth papers folded beside her stack before breakfast. She marked figures in the margins with tiny crosses he pretended not to see. Once, rain struck hard against the library windows. She reached to move a pile of invoices from the damp sill. Aldous' hand reached at the same time. Their fingers touched over a sheet of wool tallies. Both withdrew. Neither spoke for a full minute. It was dangerous proximity, because mockery had a clean shape. Respect did not. Respect asked what a woman might become if she were not forced every day to prove she had a right to think. The first real pressure came in late August. Cassius Ashby sent a new proposal regarding a canal supply investment. He promised a staggering margin provided Eastmere committed its entire wool clip to his brokers immediately. Sophronia read the copied figures twice, then a third time. The math was smooth. Too smooth. She waited until Aldous stepped out to speak with the stablemaster. Then she approached Burnley. "Mr. Burnley," she said, "Ashby's promised profit depends on selling Eastmere wool before the market rises, then buying canal grain after prices have already turned. It assumes two opposing markets will favor him on the same day." Burnley leaned closer. "That is a bold claim, Miss Pembroke. Mr. Ashby is highly regarded." "A highly regarded man can still build a trap. If the harvest is delayed even a week, this contract will bleed the estate." The heavy oak door clicked shut. Aldous stood in the room. He had heard her. "You are calling Cassius Ashby a fraud, Miss Pembroke?" he asked. "A woman of your station accusing a broker of the exchange." The coldness was back. The rigid wall. The Duke, trained to distrust every feeling that did not arrive, stamped and witnessed. Sophronia did not step back. "I am reading the numbers, Your Grace. The numbers do not care about my station." Aldous crossed his arms and questioned her. Dates, precedents, Portsmouth prices, northern supply, carrier delays, expected yield. Sophronia answered each one. She did not soften her tone. She did not plead. She delivered facts like stones dropped into still water. She expected him to point to the door. Instead, Aldous reached out. He did not take Ashby's paper. He touched the edge of her green calfskin ledger. "Show me," he said. The room altered around that sentence. Sophronia opened the ledger. For the next hour, Aldous did not mock her. He stood beside her, his sleeve almost brushing hers, and studied the columns she had built in secret. He asked questions as though her answers mattered. He frowned not at her audacity, but at Ashby's arithmetic. Mockery she knew how to fight. Respect left her without a shield. 2 days later, the wall cracked in public. Ashby arrived at Eastmere to force the matter. He called a meeting in the estate office with Aldous Burnley and two of the largest tenant farmers. Sophronia was permitted to stand near the door with a lap board taking notes. Permitted. Invisible. Ashby paced before the table, all London confidence and polished boots. "We must sell the clip now, Your Grace. Delay is sentiment. Portsmouth prices have peaked at 4 shillings the pound. If we hold, the tenants will suffer." Sophronia's hand tightened on the quill. 4 shillings. A lie, or close enough to one. She looked at the floor. A woman who spoke out of turn could be dismissed without character. A paid companion who embarrassed a London broker might never find another post. Aldous looked at Ashby. Then he turned his head. He looked past the broker, past the steward, past the farmers shifting in discomfort. He looked directly at the woman in the shadows. "Miss Pembroke," Aldous said, his voice cutting through the room. "What do you see?" The room froze. Ashby stared at him. Sophronia lifted her chin. She did not look at Ashby. She looked only at Aldous. "Portsmouth closed at 4 shillings and 3 yesterday, Your Grace. The northern clip was damaged by rot. The price is not peaking, it is climbing. If you sell today, you hand Mr. Ashby the profit that belongs in your tenant's winter pockets." Ashby's face darkened. "Your Grace, you cannot possibly take the financial counsel of a—" "The sale is delayed," Aldous interrupted. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "We will hold the wool." Ashby left with a bow sharp enough to cut cloth. The tenants withdrew more slowly, glancing at Sophronia with something close to respect. That evening the library was silent. The fire snapped in the grate. Sophronia sat at the main desk, her hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. Aldous stood by the window, looking out at the dark estate. "Within days the price will confirm it," he said. Sophronia said nothing. He turned. In the dim light, his rigid posture looked less like pride and more like strain. "When I was 10 years old," Aldous began, "I stood in the dining room and watched an inventory clerk catalogue my mother's silver. Spoons, trays, candlesticks." Sophronia stopped writing. "My father was a warm man. He believed in handshakes. He believed in a charming investor who smiled at our table and drank our wine. The man took the estate's cash reserves and vanished. The fire settled with a low crack. My father died of the shame of it a year later. I learned then that trust is a luxury an estate cannot afford. Rules do not smile at you, Miss Pembroke, but they do not ruin you either." Sophronia looked at him. For the first time she saw the boy beneath the Duke. A child in a dining room, learning that ruin could enter politely and ask for port. He was not cold because he lacked feeling. He was cold because feeling had once opened the door to disaster. But seeing him meant letting him see her, and that was far more dangerous. Ashby did not leave Eastmere quietly. If the Duke listened to a woman with a ledger, his trap would fail. Worse, others might begin checking his margins. The next afternoon, he cornered Sophronia in the hallway outside the morning room. "You are playing a dangerous game, Miss Pembroke," he said, stepping too close. "Clever women are tolerated only until they cost men their pride." Sophronia kept her back straight. "I have cost you nothing that was yours." His smile thinned. "I know your sort. Grasping, desperate. I will make it known in every drawing room in Hampshire that you are meddling in the Duke's accounts to trap him into dependence. You will not be the first, poor gentlewoman, to mistake usefulness for importance." Her blood ran cold. There it was, the weapon always waiting for a woman without fortune. Reputation. If she lost hers, she lost her post. If she lost her post, she lost her bread. Society did not need to prove a woman guilty. It only needed to make her inconvenient. She turned and walked straight to the library. Aldous looked up from the desk and saw the pale fury in her face. "Ashby has threatened to ruin my name," she said. His jaw tightened. The duty machine slammed back into place. "I will handle Mr. Ashby. You will remain out of the way until it is resolved." It was the wrong thing to say. He meant protection. It sounded like dismissal. Sophronia stopped beside the desk. "Out of the way, Sophronia. No. Do not place my Christian name on a command and expect it to sound kinder." His expression hardened. She stepped closer. The armor cracked, not with tears, but with heat. "I am the only one standing in his way. You hide behind your procedures and your titles, your grace. You do not hate women's advice. You hate the day a man you trusted made a child count empty shelves and call it duty." The mirror landed. Aldous went still. Sophronia knew she had crossed the line, but the truth had been pressed down too long. "My father was a merchant in Portsmouth," she said. "He taught me the price columns before he died. He left nothing but debts. Trading small lots through his old contacts was the only way I kept his creditors from taking his name." Her hand closed over the edge of the desk. "I am not playing at business. I am not trying to trap you. The numbers are the last piece of my father I know how to keep alive." She did not cry. She refused to give him tears that could be mistaken for weakness. She turned away, chest tight, waiting for punishment. Aldous did not speak. He saw too late that her sharpness was not vanity. It was survival. She struck first because the world had always used softness to push her back into silence. The next morning, the rumor hit Eastmere. Ashby had moved fast. Whispers filled the breakfast room before the chocolate was poured. Miss Pembroke was manipulating the accounts. Miss Pembroke was using estate papers for private gain. Miss Pembroke was an unfeminine, reckless creature trying to govern the Duke. Imogen Pelham arrived before noon under the pretense of visiting the Dowager. By 1 o'clock, 2 neighbors had called. By 2, a footman who had never once looked Sophronia in the face looked away from her too quickly. Aldous reacted with the only tool he trusted: procedure. He summoned Sophronia to the library. Burnley stood near the shelves, troubled but silent. Aldous did not look at her eyes. "Until this matter is orderly examined," he said, "you are barred from the account room. You will return the key to Mr. Burnley." He meant to shield her from scandal while he investigated Ashby quietly, but Sophronia heard only the old command. "Become smaller. Be quiet. Go back to the shadows." She reached into her pocket and placed the heavy brass key on the mahogany desk. Then she laid the green calfskin ledger beside it. Her fingers remained on the worn leather for 1 second too long. It was absurd that a book could feel warm. But her father's patient voice lived in those columns. His ruined name, his lessons, the last clear thing he had given her before debt and death swallowed the rest. To leave the ledger there felt like surrendering him to a great house that still did not know how to protect her. The sound of the book settling against the wood was soft. It felt final. "I will not need this in the Dowager's sitting room," she said. Her voice was dead. The fire had gone out of it. She walked away. For 3 days, Sophronia did not return to the library. She refused the ladies' charity knitting circle where Imogen Pelham waited with pity sharpened into triumph. She kept to her small room and folded her few gowns with careful hands. The green gown, the gray overskirt, the cream shawl, a packet of letters from Portsmouth, a pair of gloves gone shiny at the fingertips. That was all a life could become when society decided a woman had reached too high. On the 3rd night, Aldous sat alone in the library. The Michaelmas ball was 2 days away. The autumn contracts would be signed there before the county family's trustees and leading tenants. Ashby had made certain of it. Public pressure would do what private persuasion had not. Aldous looked at the green ledger on his desk. Then he opened it. He did not find manipulation. He found months of warnings. He found notes in the margins beside tenant names: Miller boy ill in February, wages delayed. Widow Arkwright needs grain credit before frost. South pasture figures unreliable after flood. She had not been playing with Eastmere's fortune. She had been guarding it. Long before he had thanked her. He turned page after page, and the truth became unbearable. By handling the matter privately, he had allowed society to keep the insult public. If he protected her in shadows, her vindication would remain hidden. She would leave Eastmere under a cloud, and every man who had laughed at her would call himself proven right. Rules had not saved her. They had caged her. The Michaelmas ball arrived under a harvest moon. The great hall of Eastmere blazed with wax candles. Garlands of late flowers hung above the portraits. Musicians waited in the gallery. The county families had come dressed in silk velvet and expectation. Sophronia stood near a pillar in her simplest gray gown. She had chosen it deliberately. No borrowed brightness, no attempt to soften the story others had written about her. Let them see exactly whom they had mocked. The whispers followed her like smoke. At the far end of the hall, a long table had been set for the autumn contracts. Cassius Ashby stood beside it, triumphant, a fresh agreement rolled open beneath the candlelight. Aldous walked to the table, in formal black evening dress, the star of his dukedom gleaming on his chest. The room quieted. The music stopped. Ashby smiled as Aldous picked up the heavy gold pen. For one breath, Sophronia thought he would sign. Not because he believed Ashby, because men like Aldous were trained to avoid scandal at any cost, and she had become scandal. Aldous held the pen. Then he set it down. He turned away from the contract and searched the crowded hall until his eyes found her gray gown. "Miss Pembroke," he said. Every head turned. Imogen Pelham's fan snapped shut. Aldous did not walk to Sophronia. He did not pull her forward. He did not present her like a prize he had rescued. He stood at the table and offered her the one thing she had fought for all her life. The floor. "Will you advise Eastmere?" he asked. The room held its breath. Sophronia's pulse struck hard once, then steadied. This was not safety. This was a choice. She stepped out from behind the pillar. A whisper rose from the ladies nearest Imogen. "There she goes," someone breathed. "Still shameless." The word struck harder than Sophronia expected. For half a second her foot stilled on the polished floor. She saw the small remainder of reputation she still possessed breaking under every eye in the hall. A woman could be wrong and forgiven. A woman could be poor and pitied. But a woman who insisted on being right in public was rarely pardoned. She felt the old command again. Shrink. Smile. Survive. Then she looked at the table, at the green ledger in Aldous' hands. Her father had taught her that columns did not become true because a man approved them. They were true because they held. Sophronia lifted her chin and walked on. The crowd parted because a duke had asked, but she crossed the floor because she chose to answer. When she reached the table, Aldous silently handed her the green calfskin ledger. He had brought it down himself. Sophronia opened it. Her hands did not tremble. "Mr. Ashby asks Eastmere to sign an advance on the canal supply," she said. "He promises a return of 12%, but his margin requires selling the estate wool today at 4 shillings. "It is a sound strategy," Ashby hissed, stepping forward. "You have no right to address—" Aldous moved into his path. He did not touch the man. He simply became an immovable wall between Ashby's anger and Sophronia's right to speak. "Let her finish," Aldous said. The command reached every corner of the hall. Sophronia turned a page. "The price in Portsmouth this morning is 4 shillings and 6pence. If Eastmere sells today,
Mr. Ashby's syndicate absorbs the difference. If the canal supply fails, Eastmere bears the debt, and the tenants lose their winter wages. A stir went through the room. She looked not at Ashby, but at the trustees and tenants whose faces had begun to change. I recommend we hold the wool for a fortnight.
We refuse the canal advance entirely. We secure winter grain through local markets and keep the margin where it belongs on the estate that earned it. Ashby's mask slipped. This is madness. You will take the word of an unfeminine, calculating woman over a London broker. Sophronia did not flinch. Hunger is not made more polite because a lady failed to count it, Mr. Ashby. And theft is not made respectable because a gentleman ordered it. The murmur that followed was no longer mockery. Burnley stepped forward from the side of the room, holding copied figures. I have verified Miss Pembroke's calculations, he said loudly. The Portsmouth closing prices, the northern rot, the carrier delays, all of it. The contract is a trap. One tenant farmer shifted his hat between both hands. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked first at Ashby, then at the trustees, and finally at Aldous, as though asking whether a man of his station was permitted to agree with a woman society had tried to disgrace. Aldous did not prompt him. He merely stood beside Sophronia, still as stone, his authority placed openly behind her words. The farmer swallowed. My eldest has 2 boys in the lower cottages, Your Grace, he said. If Miss Pembroke says the wages hold by waiting, I would rather wait. Another voice followed, then another. The room shifted person by person away from Ashby. Aldous turned to the broker. The sale will be delayed. The canal advance refused. Eastmere's fortune will follow Miss Pembroke's advice. Ashby's face twisted. You will regret making a spectacle of yourself over a woman with ink on her fingers. Aldous looked at Sophronia's hand resting on the ledger, then back at Ashby. That ink has served Eastmere better than your seal. The words landed with the weight of a public sentence. You may leave my house, Mr. Ashby. You will not return. For the first time that evening, Ashby did not know where to place his smile. He looked toward the trustees, but one had turned aside to study Sophronia's figures. He looked toward the county gentleman, but no one stepped forward. Even those who had laughed at her lowered their eyes. Ashby searched the room for one ally and found only polished backs, folded fans, and silence. The disgrace settled on him slowly enough for everyone to watch it land. At last, he bowed too stiffly to be graceful and forced his way through the crowd. The great doors closed behind him with a heavy wooden thud. No one followed. For a moment, Sophronia stood behind the table with the green ledger open before her. The same people who had whispered now looked at the figures she had written. Trustees bent their heads together. Farmers nodded. Burnley placed his papers beside hers, not over them. The vindication did not feel like triumph at first. It felt like breathing after being held under water. Aldous looked at her. He did not smile. His eyes were too unguarded for that. He had not rescued her. He had opened the door. She had walked through it with her own ledger in her hands. Weeks later, autumn settled deep over Hampshire. The wool sale succeeded brilliantly. Winter wages were secured. Grain stores were contracted through local markets. Ashby's London scheme collapsed under the scrutiny of men who had laughed at Sophronia too late. The county adjusted itself as society always did when forced to accept a truth it had mocked the day before. Ladies who had pitied Sophronia now asked where she found her price circulars. Gentlemen who had called her unfeminine began sending questions through Burnley, as though the steward had somehow become sharper overnight. Sophronia answered only the questions worth answering.
She did not attend Imogen Pelham's next knitting circle. She sent a pair of mended stockings for the charity basket and returned to the library. On a cold November morning, she stood before the tall windows and watched mist lift from the lawns. The green ledger lay on the main desk. A small basket of untouched knitting wool sat beside it, left there by the dowager with a note that read, "For sleeves, if you ever have leisure enough to require them." Sophronia had laughed when she read it. Not loudly, enough. She expected Aldous to reward her with a jewel, perhaps, or a polite letter of recommendation. It was the usual way powerful men made female usefulness vanish into gratitude, safely removed from their daily lives. The heavy oak door opened. Aldous entered. He did not carry a jewel box. He carried a small brass key. He walked to the main desk and set it down. Beside it, he placed a new leather case, plain and fine, sized exactly to fit the mended green ledger. The leather still held the faint scent of the craftsman's shop-tanned hide, beeswax, and clean thread. Sophronia touched the edge, and the smooth new surface made the scuffed corners of her old ledger seem not shabby, but honored.
"The lock on the right-hand drawer has been repaired," he said.
Sophronia looked at the key, then at him. "What is this, Your Grace?"
"A request."
He stepped closer, but not too close. He had learned the difference. "I am asking if you will advise Eastmere formally through the winter. Burnley will record the appointment through his office, and no paper will leave this desk without your review." Her throat tightened. He continued before she could answer. "I am also asking if, when you have earned enough to restore your father's counting room in Portsmouth, you might still choose to return here." A pause. To me. The room seemed very quiet. He was not asking her to become smaller for love. He was not asking her to trade her mind for a title, nor to fold her ledgers away like a childish habit. He was making room for the full shape of her life. Sophronia rested her fingers on the brass key. "I am an unfeminine woman, Aldous," she said softly, using his name for the first time. His eyes warmed at the sound. "You are the only woman I trust." He reached out and took her ink-stained hand. He did not pull her into a desperate embrace. He did not make a speech fit for a ballroom. He held her hand with the steady reverence of a man who understood its value. Sophronia looked down at their joined hands. His clean, strong, titled hand. Her ink-marked one. Neither lessened the other. The door creaked open. Hugh Burnley entered with new harvest reports. He stopped at the sight of them, lifted one gray brow, and then walked straight to Sophronia. He handed the papers to her first. "Miss Pembroke," he said, "the North Tenant figures." Aldous watched the exchange. This time he did smile. Slowly. Genuinely. As if some stern part of him had finally been allowed to rest. Sophronia set the reports on the desk. Beside them lay her mended green ledger in its new leather case. Beside that sat the small basket of knitting wool. Not discarded simply. No longer a cage. She picked up her quill. Aldous remained beside her, not above her. Outside, the first hard frost silvered the grass, but inside the library, the fire held steady. What is gentler, the hand that knits a sleeve, or the mind that keeps a whole house warm through winter?